The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Welcome back to the Durian Heat, where we discuss critical issues in Southeast Asia. In the second segment of Human Rights at the Crossroads, with Arpee Santiago, Executive Director of the Ateneo Human Rights Center in the Philippines. In this segment, he will be highlighting the human rights issues that have plagued the Philippines.
Wondering if you can elaborate more about the People Power Revolution that you were telling us about earlier.
Okay, the roots of the People Power Revolution actually was due to the declaration of martial law of former President Ferdinand Marcos way back in 1972. And during that time, the term of the President of the Philippines is only for 4 years and can be re-elected for another term of 4 years. So it was already the second term of then President Marcos. But there was also a secessionist movement being led by the Communist Party of the Philippines. And President Marcos was able to use this situation to declare martial law in 1972. When he declared martial law, he also had established his own constitution in 1973. And it allowed him to extend his term indefinitely at the time. And he also possessed legislative powers. He initially abolished Congress and later on created a sort of a dummy legislative body. Together with him, these are the bodies that are able to pass laws. So the opposition movement grew, and in 1983, the main opposition leader, who before that was incarcerated but later on exiled to the US, Ninoy Aquino, came back to the Philippines in 1983. And he was assassinated as soon as he stepped out of the plane. So that created massive demonstrations way back in 1983. It all erupted in 1986, when later on, in 1986, when the Minister of National Defense and the Chief of the Police of the Philippines decided to turn their backs against President Marcos. So the Catholic Church was also instrumental in calling the people to go to the streets and flooded the streets, protecting these two personalities who decided to turn away from the president. So the president initially ordered the military to go after these two personalities in their respective camps. But since the people flooded the streets fronting the camps, the military did not dare proceed. And later on, they just sided with the people. This led to the flee of President Marcos, which led to his exile in Hawaii. So this turn of events transformed the Philippines from a dictatorial government for 20 years to a new democratic institution. So the president right after Marcos was the wife of the assassinated opposition leader. And these two persons that I mentioned is actually the parents of the current president of the Philippines.
So would you say that that was the turning point for Philippines, especially the transformation from dictatorial to a more democratic country?
Um, that's one of the key points. Of course, when that happened, there are a number of challenges that had to be addressed, which are still prevailing at the moment. Number one, for example, many of the democratic institutions before martial law were corrupted and damaged during martial law. So, topmost of that is the military establishment. This is the reason why at still some point we have a lot of extrajudicial killings that are happening because this had been a practice of the military for quite some time. So up to now, it's taking a lot of time to reorient the military as to its real role in protecting the people, especially those who would dissent against official government policy.
I'm sorry, Arpee,
Another
but also since like decades ago, hundreds of activists and journalists and environmentalists, they have been killed by the members of the security forces. And then, could you elaborate more on that regarding the local
well,
human
this
rights?
is yes, this is part of the systemic problems. Of course, there had been a major change in terms of democratic institutions in the capital. But there are some places in the Philippines where it became sort of fiefdoms by many of the political clans. So in these areas, this is particularly in Mindanao, political families actually rule the area, and the local government is actually led by many of the political families and clans. And part of the corrupted system, which still can be traced way back to martial law, is that there is no real elections in a sense that has been happening, because the people who elect leaders in those areas fear for their lives, so they tend to just re-elect the political family in power. Otherwise, they know that their lives are in peril. So this is what happened when two political clans were clashing as to control of a certain province in Mindanao. And I think what you were referring to is the Ampatuan massacre, which happened around 5 years ago, when a convoy of the wife of a political clan leader was going within the province in order to file the certificate of candidacy of his husband, of her husband, and she had a convoy of journalists with her. But since again the existing political leader at that time had control of government resources, including using the security forces as his private army, he was able to massacre the convoy. And this actually could not have been discovered if there was no whistleblower who would have stated about what happened. So this just shows that the sense of impunity of some political leaders, that they think that they can get away with such an atrocious act. And although this has created a big uproar, not only in the Philippines but also internationally. And cases, criminal cases, have been filed. Um, Up to now, the prosecution of those cases have not yet finished. Um, Again, one of the more damaged institution as well is the slow moving of the courts in the Philippines because of clogged court dockets, and also there are influences that are happening within the bureaucratic mechanisms in the Philippines. So these are many of the democratic processes which are being protected and being in a way uh, observed right now by many Filipinos and also international human rights workers, because if the prosecution of these atrocities would fail, then it would lead to the impunity of these human rights violators, and it would just show that there is really no accountability for such already an atrocious human rights violation. Um, so it's still a continuing process right now in the Philippines. Although the Philippines has already been dubbed as a newly democratic country, um, it still continues to cleanse its ranks in order to ensure that there is proper accountability mechanisms, and that those perpetrators who have violated the rights of many of these victims would really be brought to justice. And that massacre is just one of the multifaceted sides of the the challenge on access to justice here in the Philippines.
Yeah, so RP, so regarding all these issues regarding political movement, and then the people been voicing regarding the human rights in the Philippines, but apart from this, there are also other areas, for example, environmental issues, because we believe that the activists in the Philippines, they've been quite vocal in opposing the mining and the energy operations, that they said it will definitely threaten the environment and it will replace all those tribal communities from their land, and all it's actually a face attack that happened in the 2012. So what is your view in this, and then how has been moved forward since then?
Okay. In terms of civil society movement, there has been moves, a lot of NGOs that are now trying to empower communities, and way after the change of the government in the People Power Revolution, there has been a number of really good laws that have been put in place. Actually, in terms of strong, good, and model laws, the Philippines is actually soaring in terms of very good laws, human rights related legislation. What if it's poor is its implementation actually of these laws. And part of the new constitution after the People Power Revolution is having a section or an article on social justice and human rights, acknowledging certain sectors that need to be given priority by the government. For example, farmers and peasants, which led to the adoption of the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. Another is on Indigenous peoples, which led to the passing of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Another on environment, which have led to a number of environmental legislation, such as the Clean Air Act, the need to have an environmental impact assessment, and Um, now, which also allowed the questioning of the current mining law of the Philippines before the Supreme Court, which is still pending decision. Now, I mentioned about the good laws,
Yes.
but I'll go one by one.
All right.
And end with the environment. With the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, the idea is that the landowners who have vast tracts of lands but are actually tenanted by many of the farmers, the idea is to distribute these lands to the farmers so that the farmers would actually own the land they till. And the concept is not taking of the land by the government, but the government would buy these lands from many of the landowners. But this has not been implemented properly. In fact, this has been blocked despite several extensions because many of the landed people in the Philippines are part of the government. Many of them are actually part of Congress. Even our current president has been criticized because his family owns vast tracts of lands. So the implementation has been very dismal for the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform. For the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, the main feature of this is getting the free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, of Indigenous peoples. And in many of the lands of the Indigenous peoples, in the Philippine Constitution, we call these as ancestral domain of the Indigenous peoples. These ancestral domains are actually the areas where there are a lot of good natural resources and even mineral resources. So this is where mining companies would go because these are the mountainous areas. Again, the problem here is that due to the lack of information of many of the indigenous peoples, they give their consent in these development activities without actually knowing how the mining activities would later on degrade the environment where they live in. So they benefit financially at the present immediate term, but they fail to realize that the longer lasting effect would be for them to suffer. So due to more aggressive civil society participation, more indigenous peoples are made aware of this, and many of these indigenous peoples now actually question many of these development projects that have been happening. Of course, this has been a source of problem also for the government, because for the government, mining is also a source of funds, and it would in a way be good to the economy of the government. So there has been a head-on clash as to the government policy before, and up to now there is a revisiting of that policy on mining, and how to reconcile this with the issues of environment, and also with issues of the indigenous peoples. And one boiling factor on the environment right now is its effects to climate change. And one development project that has also been looming and happening at the moment is that the Philippines, if you look at current events, there's a looming power crisis in the Philippines, and the president is actually asking for emergency powers in order to suspend the implementation of some of the environmental laws in order to address the situation. And the immediate and quick term solution is for the creation, establishment of more coal-fire powered plants. But these are not clean and renewable sources of energy. So this would actually add to the emissions, add to the pollution. So 2 year, a year ago, a little more than a year ago, the Philippines has been the victim of Typhoon Haiyan or
Yeah.
Typhoon Yolanda, locally known. And these past few years, there has been more super typhoons that have been hitting the Philippines.
Yes.
Although the Philippine government has been doing its share on disaster preparedness and reduction, having these super typhoons actually show that climate change is actually real. It's really happening.
Of course.
And all of us in Southeast Asia are feeling the brunt now of climate change. So having a policy on coal-fire powered plants is actually runs counter to addressing the issues of climate change. And of course, when you talk about business interests, many businesses are more interested in investing in coal-fire powered plants rather than in the more expensive renewable clean energy, because it's easier, it's cheaper for them to establish, and the gains immediately of recouping their investment is much faster for these businesses. So these are some of the environmental concerns right now which have impacts to the lives of many Filipino peoples. And of course, when disaster strikes, it is still seen as a human rights issue because many of their resources would actually be hit. Many of them would be displaced. Many women and children, particularly, would be greatly affected by these disasters.
Of course.
So it would also lead to a cycle of poverty. And in the Typhoon Haiyan stricken areas, for example, 1 year after it's happening, majority actually are still living in tents. And because of this situation and their reliance merely on relief goods, a good number have been victims of trafficking. So these again are human rights issues that need to be addressed.
This is the end of the second segment of a three-part interview with Arpee Santiago on human rights at the Crossroad. You are now listening to The Durian Heat.
You're now listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing.